I have to say, I'm excited to bring in our next guest, Leslie Pielack. She is the director of the Birmingham Museum. You have one of the coolest backdrops right now via Zoom that we have ever seen. Thank you for being with us on the MegaCast.
You're welcome. I do have to give credit. This is a photo taken by one of the volunteers that does cemetery tours, which I'm guessing we'll be talking about. And I think it's a stellar photo, so I had to share it.
Yeah, so for those on the radio that aren't seeing what we're seeing right now, is it is a foggy backdrop of the cemetery. And that leads us into what we want to talk about is the Friends of the Birmingham Museum conduct cemetery tours in the fall time. Tell us about that and what can people expect?
Sure. On a regular basis, for a number of years now, the Friends of the Birmingham Museum, which is really also the Birmingham Historical Society, aka, have been conducting tours, docent-led tours throughout the historic Greenwood Cemetery in Birmingham. The Greenwood Cemetery is the oldest public cemetery in Oakland County, for sure, and in a lot of lower Michigan. And the story of its founding is part of what is featured on each tour, because it was actually the result of a horrific axe murder that was committed in 1825 when Birmingham was just a small settlement, which didn't even have the name Birmingham yet. And so the history of the cemetery, although it starts with such a terrible crime, actually includes some of the most interesting community history of really any place in Oakland County. And I also have to mention there are other historic cemeteries that are very, very interesting also, but they came about slightly later. So we claim that, earliest role. The cemetery is a beautiful setting. It is has rolling landscape. It's a beautiful park-like setting with mature trees. It's one of the most peaceful areas in the city of Birmingham. If you can imagine such a busy city having a quiet, peaceful place, this is it. The cemetery has over 3,000 graves, about 650 of them being from the 19th century. So when the cemetery tours are conducted, the docents lead the participants through the cemetery, through different parts of it, and talk about important people who have been buried here, really from the earliest times all the way up until recently.
Leslie Pielack with us. She's the director of the Birmingham Museum. Leslie, I went to school in Charleston, South Carolina, and history is so important down there. I did my first cemetery tour while I was a college student, and it was fascinating, the history behind the city, and that's what it was. It was sharing the history of the city as well, but they actually enacted parts of like the plays and this and that in the cemetery, but tickets were very hard to come by. Do you have to have a ticket for this event, and do they sell out, or are plenty available?
Well, great question. And of course, during our pandemic environment, we're making some adaptations to make the tour as comfortable for people as possible. Generally speaking, this year we are not expecting to have any set limits. We do have, under the governor's order, there would be, if we had 100 people, that would be the maximum that we can have. This is an outdoor activity, and we will be practicing social distancing. Every participant is expected to wear a mask. We'll be following all the necessary public health precautions. And but the plus on this year is that we have been able to provide, the docents will be leading people through with voice amplification devices, so they'll be very easy to be heard, even when people are strung out a little bit more into a wider range. It is a large cemetery. There's enough room for that many people to walk along and practice social distancing. The ticket price of $10 per person would be payable at the gate in cash or with a check, because we won't be able to make any kind of exchange, any kind of cash change or anything this year, or use credit cards. So must be cash or check. There is a sign-in procedure. There is a liability waiver this year that we are asking everyone to sign to participate. And if people want to come to the tour, they would come to the Greenwood Cemetery, which is on Oak Street in Birmingham. And they would come to the East Gate, and they would enter there. And I need to just add one more comment here about the physical access. There is no parking inside the cemetery. Participants will have to find parking on the street outside the cemetery and then walk to the cemetery.
Joining us today from the Birmingham Museum is their director, Leslie Pielack, with us today on the Oakland County Megacast. So on these tours of the historic cemetery, the historic Greenwood Cemetery, what are some of the attractions or historic attractions rather on location that people can expect to be able to see and learn about along their tour?
Well, actually, there are so many interesting people buried here in Greenwood Cemetery that the docent-led tours are actually separated into a pioneer tour and a 20th century notables tour. So for our fall tour, we concentrate on the oldest cemetery inhabitants. I mentioned at the outset that the cemetery was founded because of a terrible axe murder that took place in 1825. And so that is actually the beginning of the tour, talks about that incident and the people involved. Their graves are marked there, and all of the particulars about how the cemetery was founded as a result of their deaths, because the community wanted to come together and acknowledge their passing by having a public burying site for them. And that became our public cemetery. So that story is told, and the people involved, their names were Pollyann and Cynthia Utter. And so the whole history of the Utters and what happened to them is the beginning of the tour. The tour also includes a number of other Birmingham pioneers. As was mentioned, at the beginning of our interview here, there is a lot of history behind individual stories that people don't generally learn about until they're actually walking through a cemetery and a docent is explaining to them why this particular person made such an impact on this community. And I think that's the people part that we always accentuate. And I think that's the advantage of any cemetery tour is, yes, you are touring a historic site and it is, about a community's history, but it's about the people. And most of them are important for their community, but they may not be the kind of names that everybody would know. So in our cemetery tour, we basically tell the story of Birmingham's founding by talking about the different important people who found Birmingham. Another interesting story relates to John West Hunter and his family, who came here and were the first land purchasers here in the place that is now called Birmingham. And the couple of other men who came with him and kind of had a business scheme to make some money, and did that by purchasing all their property to connect along the Saginaw Trail, which is Woodward Avenue, going through Birmingham. So their story is told. Their wives were sisters and all migrated here together, so their story is told. Further on in the tour, one of our local, I kind of think of her as like the Queen of Birmingham in a way, Martha Baldwin, who came about in the latter part of the 19th century, which really changed our town. And she's responsible for a lot of the important civic and community organizations that still function here, including the Baldwin Public Library, for example. And so her story and how she connects to women's suffrage will be part of the tour. And if I can just stop to say that the suffrage movement, which ratified the 19th Amendment 100 years ago this year is an important feature that will be included this year. And lastly, for me to mention right now is that we recently learned about the burial in the cemetery of formerly enslaved people who had lived in Birmingham and were the first African American property owners in Birmingham, and who were buried in Greenwood but did not receive a marker. And we did not know of their existence because their story had been lost until it was rediscovered again by a volunteer, George Getchman, who uncovered their story. And then we've done some additional research. So we know exactly now where they're buried in the cemetery. We know more about their story, how they were escaped slaves who came to Birmingham, the Birmingham area, farmed for many years, and then purchased a home and became an important part of the community right around the turn of the century. So their story is going to be included, and we also are making it possible for people, if they would like to donate to a campaign to raise money to install a monument, they'll have that opportunity also.
Such fascinating history right there in the city of Birmingham. Do you know how he was able to discover the information about the Taylors so late?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. But if you can think about every detective novel you've ever read and how the detectives are putting together just different strings of information and trying to create a fabric of what happened, it kind of came up like that. It was an obituary that had been printed in the local newspaper, which no longer exists in print form, of course, but it was on microfiche. And the researcher, George, was looking through some materials and came across this obituary and read it and was fascinated. I mean, the names of the people were recorded and we have them in the cemetery, but no one knew their story or knew that they were African American or that they were former slaves until this obituary surfaced. So once he found the obituary, we all worked together on that, and we got some good partnership in the community from the Daughters of the American Revolution local Heidi Hill chapter, as well as the Friends of the Birmingham Museum that I mentioned, working together to get these funds raised. So it is sometimes a little bit of fortune, just kind of knocking on your door and saying, here's something you didn't know existed. And then it opens up a whole doorway. So we're very excited about this project because it's going to recognize these people who clearly were a big part of the community and very well known and highly regarded, and yet we didn't know they existed. So we want to bring their lives back into focus for people from this point forward now.
Still uncovering and discovering our history. So Leslie, while we have you on the show, can you bring us up to date as to the museum? Is it still closed to the public, or are some aspects open?
Thanks. Yes, we are closed to the public. That is to say, the actual physical building is not accessible to the public, but we are open in the sense that we're doing a pop-up exhibit for our museum, literally taking materials outside under a tent and as a pop-up on Friday afternoons in September. We're focusing on our suffrage related materials. We have some really interesting women from Birmingham who did some pretty incredible political things. For example, the first woman mayor in Michigan was from Birmingham. We also have someone from Birmingham who was the first woman astronaut in a group of women astronaut trainees, and a number of other fascinating women who, as soon as women earned the right to vote, they got involved in politics right away, local and as well as further out. So we're talking about that at our, let's call it a pop-up stand for lack of a better term right now. We're also doing a lot of virtual material. People can go to our website, which is www.bhamgov.org/museum. And you can find content links to, numerous virtual exhibits. Many of our video materials are there. We have video shorts, We have behind the scenes in the museum. You can see what it's like to walk into some of the back rooms in the museum. We unbox items and a lot of other interesting content. So we hope that if people have more questions, they'll call us. The number here is 248-530-1682.
Such fascinating stuff for all of us to really take time to learn about the history of the cities in which we live. Leslie, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us here on the Oakland County MegaCast. We definitely appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I hope that everyone enjoys all local cemeteries this fall.